like to welcome all of you here on behalf of Cork Meeting. We're really delighted to be hosting this event, and thanks very much to the EcoQuakers Ireland committee for having organised it and having the audacity to do something as daring as having an in-person workshop. Well done. So we're delighted to have you here. If you haven't seen the panels of this Loving Earth project, feel free to have a look at them whenever you have some free time during lunch or before you leave. And feel free to have a look around the building as well. And if you have any questions about the refurbishment and extension that we did, just grab somebody who looks like they might have a clue. And if they don't have a clue, they'll directly to somebody who does. But we did try to make it as sort of environmentally friendly as possible. And there are a number of features of that sort. So we hope you really enjoy being in the building as well. And I'm happy to turn things over to Brían.
I'd also like to welcome you all, friends, to this wonderful in-person gathering. My name is Brían Ó'Súilleabháin. I'm the convener of EcoQuakers Ireland Committee. And this gathering has been a long time in the making. I think originally, I've written down here, original date was the 5th of May 2020, and some other forces greater than ourselves stopped us from holding that in person. But we're delighted to be able to finally do this in person with you all here. Little shy of 2 years later, but we're very, very fortunate to be here in the brand newly refurbished Cork Meeting House, possibly the most sustainable meeting house in the country now at this stage. And to fill in the Saturday that would normally be at IOIM this time of year, but that's a little bit later this year in the summer, so we're very delighted to be filling in on that Saturday. And I'd like to welcome, of course, everybody here, so Quakers and non-Quakers alike. And we're also delighted to be here at the same time as the Living Earth project, so as Denise said, I encourage you to check that out while you're here as well.
Our first speaker is the main organizer of this event, or one of them, Brían Ó'Súilleabháin. He's the convener of the EcoQuakers Ireland Committee. He's an actor, writer, and climate activist. And we're very happy to have him share some of his thoughts with us today.
It's important to look at my watch. Oh, there's a clock on the wall. I have a very vivid first memory. The first memory that I have of my first lesson about climate breakdown and climate change. I was 8 years old, and my primary school teacher was holding up a globe, a model of the Earth, and she told us that at the bottom of the Earth there was a hole. This hole had been created by all of us humans on this planet, by throwing away our rubbish. This rubbish was making a hole in the Earth. Of course, she was speaking about the ozone layer and the damage that CFCs and other gases were doing to that ozone layer, but to an 8-year-old child, I took that literally. There was a hole in the Earth, and we caused it with our rubbish. So we needed to stop. So that's what I did. From about 8 years old, I was hooked, and I took that mission very, very seriously. I joined the Green Schools Committee that we had, and every lunchtime I would go around emptying the recycling bins, turning off all the lights in the classrooms, making sure that all the taps were turned off. I saved water. I put a brick in my cistern in the toilet to make sure that you need all that water. I took shorter showers. I did all of that because in my mind that's what we needed to do. If just everybody could take that little bit of time, that little bit of extra effort and work to turn off their lights and recycle, we could do it. We could save the planet. So the theme of this gathering, the reason I speak about that first, the theme of this gathering is from disappointment to hope. But my journey didn't start with disappointment. My journey started with hope. And I think that's really, really important to highlight, that really my journey was more from hope to disappointment to hope to disappointment? Question mark. And it's really important to highlight that it started from hope, because we're going to hear an awful lot about hope today. I know that the other speakers today are going to speak about hope a lot, and a lot of us spoke of hope too. But it's also equally important to leave space for that disappointment, to have time to grieve and to despair, because to be perfectly honest with all of you, it's bloody depressing. This has been my whole life. This has been 18 years of recycling and turning off lights and trying to save water. And in that time, I haven't necessarily seen anything get better. If anything, I've seen it get worse. We've increased our consumption of fossil fuels. We've increased our waste. We've increased the hoarding of wealth to the global north and continue to deprive our fellow humans in the global south. And that despair is very real among my generation. We are probably the first generation that were taught from that very early age that this is the damage that we are doing to the planet. And often the phrase that we hear is, what sort of planet are we leaving to our children? I don't want to have children, because I don't think there's going to be a planet left for them to have. My girlfriend also feels the same way, and I didn't ask her a question. She just told me, flat out, I don't think I want to have children because I don't think there's going to be anything left for them. And there's a lot of people that I know, a lot of friends my age, who feel the same way. Earlier this month we had the census, and it's a lovely idea. At the end there was a time capsule in the census where you could write in, draw in something, and that would be opened in 100 years' time. And the sentiment among everybody in my generation that I knew was, gosh, that's very optimistic. The thought that anybody would be around in 100 years' time to read that. So that is the despair that we are dealing with and can be dealing with. And despair is a tool that can be used for good or for evil, much in the same way that hope can, because I think possibly the problem and the reason that we've ended up in all of this despair is that we might have been a little bit too hopeful. We might have thought that if we could all just reduce our consumption a little bit, if we could all just recycle a bit more, then everything would be fine. It wasn't really until 2016 that I began to feel that disappointment and that despair, and that I thought maybe we're not going to be able to do this. But fortunately, around about that same time, I also joined EcoQuakers, and I think that despair and that disappointment is a real driving force. It's a real motivational tool, and it can encourage us to start taking things a little bit more seriously, to stop being overly optimistic and overly hopeful, and think, you know what, we really have to do something about this. And the story of EcoQuakers for me is the story of two books. And yes, I'm an actor writer, so naturally I'm going to plug the books that I wrote. And the first book was one that was written just in 2016, just as I joined. It was written in response to IYM Minute 40 of 2016. And Ireland Yearly Meeting. It's important to get the terms right, of course. But it was written in response to Ireland Yearly Meeting, Minute 2016, Minute 40 of 2016, which was to commit to making all meetings within Ireland Yearly Meeting as sustainable as possible. And this little booklet was designed as a tool to help meetings do that. And it's filled with a few sustainability plans. We called on meetings to look at areas in their meeting houses where they could be more sustainable. And it comes with lots of tips, such as considering purchasing fair trade and organic food where possible, insulating buildings where possible, check water outlets and make sure they're not dripping, turning off the lights, recycling, all that sort of stuff. And that's a good place to start, it really is. I'm not decrying that. But that's the sort of very hopeful things at the start. But we began to get a little bit more serious. We began to do a lot more. We began thinking, okay, we need to take this to the next level. And so we produced a booklet about ethical investment. We encouraged friends to divest from companies that were harming our shared economy, that were harming our planet. We produced a short film about spirituality and how it ties in to care for our planet. We hosted sustainability gatherings such as this in Belfast and online. And we asked Ireland Yearly Meeting to recognise that there was a climate and biodiversity emergency. And we did that in 2020. Friends in Ireland recognised there was a climate breakdown and we needed to do something about it. And of course, what we heard from all of the meetings across Ireland was, well, we'd love to do something about it, but we don't know what to do. We're still turning off lights and fixing taps. So for an entire year, EcoQuakers Ireland Committee worked on this booklet right here, Regenerating Our Common Home. And as you can see, it is considerably larger than this one. And it is very, very detailed. We looked at everything under the sun. We looked at carbon neutrality. And we discussed, is this something that we actually want to do? Are there benefits? Are there downsides? Is carbon neutrality something we want to achieve? Or should we strive to achieve it? We looked again at ethical investments. We looked at properly insulating and refurbishing buildings. Not just say, go away and do it, but how do you do it? How do you get the funds to do that? Where are the best places to go for it? We looked at bringing in the test of sustainability to all our decisions. Do we really need to travel for all of these committee meetings? Can we not possibly do them online? Or can we not possibly amalgamate them all together, do them all on the same day? Is this action necessary? Are there other alternatives to this action? And what can I do to offset the impact to the environment that this action will take? And that is really what we need to be thinking about in everything that we do, not just as friends, but as a society in general. We looked as we get at, again, investments and becoming more ecological in our meeting houses. We're here in Cork Meeting House, which has a whole page, whole 2 pages actually, within this booklet. It's a case study of how to become a more sustainable and environmentally friendly building, because we have wildflower gardens here. We've got a burial ground which allows wildlife and plants to grow in it. We have very, very well insulated and doors and grand heat pumps and solar panels. There's a lot that we can learn from just this one building that we are sitting in. And there are meeting houses in the north that have beehives and beekeepers using their burial grounds, and these bees are producing wonderful ethical honey that you can share. There's a lot we can do, and this booklet really does show an excellent pathway to doing that. There's a lot of there's about an entire chapter for the premises committee on really looking at every little possible thing you can do, from the very, very small stuff right to the very, very top. Now, I'm not saying this is the be-all and end-all. This is simply a guide. But it gives me a lot of hope, because there was a lot of enthusiasm among the committee when we were writing this. And we wrote this in 2021 when we were not allowed to meet in person at all. But every Saturday, for an hour in the morning, we would meet online, sometimes an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours. We'd get carried away. But we would meet online, and we worked on this for an entire year to get it created. And I was so happy when it was finished. I was so proud, I was so joyful, I was so hopeful. And that was the end of 2021. So we went, as I said, from hope to disappointment, back to hope. But there is that disappointment, again with the question mark, because as this was coming out, we had COP26, where the greatest polluters in the world, greatest nations that pollute, China, India, Saudi Arabia, the scientific consensus is we have at the bare minimum until 2050 to get this sorted. That is our deadline, and we have these greatest polluters in the world saying we could do it by 2060, 10 years too late. That was a gut blow. That was really, really sore to hear. Phase down fossil fuels as opposed to phase out. Then at the start of this year, of course, we have the war in Ukraine, and we're seeing increased militarization all over the world. Everyone's first reaction is to reach for guns and bombs and tanks. And every country's climate targets deliberately exclude the military from their calculations because we couldn't possibly make the military more sustainable. Because you can't. And we're seeing firsthand the blood that is caused and the suffering and the death that is caused by fossil fuels, by gas and oil from Russia. That is fueling the devastation that is happening in Eastern Europe. We're seeing it firsthand. And so while I had that wonderful dash of hope at the end of 2021, that disappointment is starting to creep in again. And I don't know really where to end this talk. I didn't put in a line, I just ended on disappointment question mark. But I think it's, without putting too much pressure, I think it's up to us, really. Because my job as convener of EcoQuakers Ireland was to answer the concerns of Friends in Ireland with regards to the environment, to get Friends in Ireland to care about our shared home again, to care about our planet. And I think we're starting to see that. We're getting a lot more, we got a lot more numbers today than we were expecting to get. That gives me a little bit of hope. Because ultimately, if I can't get friends who are, in my experience, the most loving, caring, generous, thoughtful people in the world to care about this sort of thing, what hope do we have?
Now I'd like to call Andew Orr up to give his presentation, and hopefully it will all work. Andew is the chair of an organisation called EcoQuakers Ireland. Some of you may be aware of this. It's a wonderful organisation that tries to link people in different churches across the island to come together and work for the environment, caring for creation. He has a background working for an environmental NGO and then became a Church of Ireland priest, and he's currently working in Yaw in Middleton, so not too far away.
Well, it's lovely to be with you. Thank you all very much for inviting me. Thanks to Brían for inviting me and being with you. You know, there's a lot we've already covered this morning, so my talk, I think, probably would be, if I did it all, a little bit long, so I'm going to whiz through some of it fairly quickly and really concentrate the things that I really want to talk about this morning about disappointment and hope and what we in church faith communities can do to nurture hope when disappointment comes. So the first few slides I have in this talk because sometimes I talk to groups that aren't on board with perhaps their bit of the climate emergency and things. So I will fairly quickly skate through these. But just a couple of things, you know, here's very much the issues. We all know about climate change, biodiversity loss, and all the other things that go along with it, soil destruction, water pollution, habitat loss. These are the things that we're all only too familiar with. Again, you know, we've already heard a lot about the carbon budget, about 1.5 degree rise, 2 degrees. I'm not going to dwell on this for too long. And here's some of the things, some of the results that we might see very locally. Here's what happened I wasn't in Cork in 2009, some of you were, no doubt were, 2009, 2020. These are the kind of flooding events that we are going to see increasingly as time goes on. Even if we manage to keep the 1.5 degree warming, we're still going to see a lot more frequency of this. And here's a couple of maps which I think might bring this home to us. Okay, these next set of maps are not extreme examples of what's going to happen. These are the most likely scenarios. Okay, this is Dublin, which I'm sure lots of you are familiar with. All the areas in red will be subject to being flooded at least once a year by 2050. Not under the most extreme scenario, this is the most likely scenario. Unless people build walls, okay, and keep the sea out, all those areas of Dublin are likely to be flooded on an annual basis. Okay. Here's the same map for Cork. Okay. And I've zoomed it in a little bit to Cork City here. Okay, so I suspect not just down the road from here, likely to be flooded on an annual basis. Okay. And just in case we felt like getting too parochial about all this, here's the same map for Bangladesh. Okay. Right. So, there's no doubting the urgency of the task that faces us. Okay. You can get, if you go to the website climatecentral.org, you can get maps for anywhere in the world, and there are sort of sliders to say most extreme, least extreme, if we're lucky, if we're not lucky. Okay, and you can get these kind of maps. Okay, and we talk about what's happening here. This is the developing world has already seen this. Places like Malawi where the rains are no longer regular, and so they're facing real crises now of providing enough food for people locally. And you may be aware that in Madagascar, what's considered the first real climate change famine was threatened last year and will probably be coming again this year. Okay, if you live in a Pacific island like this, this is, you can see what a sea level rise is going to do to your entire country. Okay, so this is Tuvalu. Okay, so it's only a luxury. The debate, as he says, only a luxury of privileged communities. Okay, so there's a problem. I'm sure most of you are well aware of this. Okay, now, some of you talked about some of the environmental issues that you were aware of when you were much younger. This has been an issue for quite a while. And this is a really interesting paper that was written way back in 1967 by a professor called Lynn White. And he argued that traditional Christianity was one of the main drivers of environmental destruction. He quoted a verse from Genesis chapter 138 where God says to Adam, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over it." Okay, and he says, Christianity not only established a dualism of man and nature, he insisted it's God's will that man exploit nature for its proper ends. Western Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion the world has seen. Okay, so he didn't pull his punches on this one. And his argument is that traditional Christianity has seen the purpose of being Christian is to escape from this world. Okay? If you live a good life, you die, you go to heaven. Okay? And it really doesn't matter what you do to the planet. Okay? It really doesn't matter what you do to the planet because you're going to escape it anyway, if you've been good enough. Or you believe the right things or whatever. Okay? And he says this produces a hierarchical view of creation. Okay? God on top, men underneath, women underneath that, if they're lucky, useful animals, and then wild animals. Okay, very okay. Alright. So one of the places that I wanted to go with you this morning is I think there is much more hope in Christianity than is sometimes we understand it. And those of us people of faith here will see perhaps that if we look more closely, particularly at the scriptures that I want to look at this morning, the Hebrew scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, and the New Testament, that there's a lot more environmental care, environmental understanding, and some of the wonder and the sacredness that you were talking about this morning is there in the scriptures. Okay, and here's just a few things. I could talk for hours on this, so I'll try not to. One of the Psalms particularly emphasise that actually it's not just human beings that praise God as we understand he or she to be. Actually, the whole of the creation, the whole of the biodiversity is there, and when it fulfills its proper purpose, it reflects the character of God, him or herself. Okay, so you see constantly, if you read the Psalms carefully, it's the whole of creation is like a choir that praises God when it's doing the right thing. Okay, and so it's the reflection of God, him or herself, in the world around us. And lots of you mentioned that this morning, the sacredness, the wonder that we see. Okay, and if you read the scriptures carefully, you'll see that. I mentioned that verse from Genesis before, and again, if we look closely, I'm no Hebrew scholar, but look closely at the words, dominion is much more about organisation, about care, about well-being. And subdue, again, is a word that's really connected to farming, about looking after the land properly and organising well-being. So it's not a verse to say that we can do what we like with the planet. It's much more a verse about what we can do to care for it. I'll just give you a few more examples of where I find hope through the scriptures. You're all familiar with the Noah story from the book of Genesis, okay? And again, little verse detail that we mightn't spot in it. Okay, God makes a covenant, an agreement with the human beings that they're to look after the world, and he too will promise not to flood it again, if you like, in this myth story. But the covenant is not made just with the human beings, but with, it says, all living creatures. Okay, so there's a promise from God, him or herself, to have an agreement, not just with humans, but with all living creatures. And again, very carefully, in a lot of the Old Testament books, this idea of the land having a Sabbath, not just human beings having a day off a week, but the land getting a year off every 7 years. Okay? And we all know about crop rotation and so forth, but that's actually built in as a biblical principle. And then finally the Jubilee year, the seventh of those 7-year cycles, the 49th year, the land is to get a complete break, and in theory at least, it's to be returned to the original owners, the original workers of that land. So nobody gets the land for more than 49 years before it goes back. Whether that happened in practice is a debate, but there it is as a principle. Okay, just a couple more things. Prophets, again, make this link between the environment and human wickedness, which I think is a crucial point here. Human sin, human evil, destroying the land. And that goes right back even here to the prophet Hosea. I'm going to whiz through these things very quickly. Okay, in the New Testament, and I mentioned that idea that the purpose of Christianity traditionally is seen as escaping from the earth. Okay, we die, we go to heaven. But in fact, the New Testament puts it very differently. It starts with the incarnation. God actually becomes a human being. In other words, a human being, the matter of which we're made, of which all of us are made, of which the earth is made, the people of the dust, if you like. God becomes one of us, and matter actually matters to God. And that's seen in where Christ is raised from the dead and becomes not just a spirit, but a body, a transformed body, if you like. And finally, and Paul often gets a bad press, and rightly so sometimes, St. Paul actually, if you read the New Testament really closely, and in some of his letters, he says, in fact, it's not about the human beings primarily. God's plan is firstly for all creation to be redeemed, transformed, restored. Okay? That's the crucial part of God's plan, not the human beings. They're an afterthought, if you like. It's actually all creation that is redeemed and changed. So that brings me hope as a Christian, that is the plan of God for ultimate redemption. So here's perhaps and then just very quickly, because we just had Easter Sunday last Sunday, and we had the story at church. Mary Magdalene spots Jesus, doesn't recognise there isn't Jesus. Okay? Instead, he thinks he's the gardener, and nothing in St. John's Gospel is ever accidental. I think God, that's mistaking Jesus for being the gardener, is a real clue here that God is looking after the planet, the redemption of the whole planet, not just us human beings. So, our human beings are to be the new gardeners, if you like, where Adam, as it would have seen it in the Genesis story, where we look after the planet properly. Okay, very quickly. Okay. So, again, perhaps this is a better view than the hierarchical one, in which human beings are interdependent on all the things on earth and surrounded by God who animates the whole thing. Okay. Again, just a little bit of a number of theologians came together about 20 years ago to ask what is the essence of faith, what is the essence of faith communities, and they came up with these 5 different things they call the 5 marks of mission. And you see the 5th one there: to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. So it's an essential part of what it means to be a person of faith. Okay. Grand. So what do Christians, I think, bring? Just conscious of the time here. Okay, and we've touched on some of these from our speakers this morning. I think there's some really important things that we bring to the table as people of faith, working in this whole area of the environment and climate change. We bring that prophetic voice. We're used to hearing the voices of prophets who say, we are on the wrong path, we need to change. Okay, we're used to that. Lament. Okay, and I think Brían touched on that just now when he talked about that sense of not wanting to have children, not wanting to have another generation. We are used, as people of faith, to giving space to lament what has gone wrong, to have that sense of grief as to what we've lost. And a lot of the world has lost that sense of being able to grieve, okay, grieve properly. Think of the Psalms. Think of Psalm 130. Out of the depths have I cried to you, O Lord. We have a language sometimes of this sense of being able to lament what's gone and have grief for what we've lost. And climate grief is a real issue for a lot of people. We have that sense in which we need to be able to take responsibility, and we've heard a lot about that already this morning from Brían. That love and justice are priorities, and that there is hope. And I think Brían really struck me there today when he was talking about that cycle of disappointment to hope, to disappointment to hope again. If our hope is built on something real and solid, we can find ourselves ways out of the disappointment. Okay. Just very quickly, a little bit about eco-congregation for what we try and do. And I think Brían has touched on a huge amount of that through that wonderful document that you have produced as EcoQuakers. What we try and do is to put much of what you put in that document into the lives of lots of different denominations across the island of Ireland, and indeed it's beyond Ireland as well. So what we do is we have an award scheme, and we encourage churches and faith communities across Ireland to really put these ideas into practical action. So here we are. We've been going since 2005, and we've had Society of Friends representatives on our committee right from the beginning. And Fran, who's here this morning, is the current representative, so we'd have you with us, Fran. Okay, and we ask you to work on 4 areas if you're becoming an eco-congregation. So spiritual, what things you can do in your worship life, practical things that we heard so much about from Brían this morning, working with your local community, whether it's bird watch groups or all sorts of things, people, tiny towns, and so forth, and also having a global perspective. So people often ask me, where do we start? And I think Brían's covered a huge amount of that already, and there's a huge amount in the booklet, or in your booklet, lots of ideas. If you register with us on ecocongregationireland.com, we will help you begin to put some of those ideas in practical action. And ask yourself, what are we doing already? What sort of things are we doing already? And the wonderful resource that's the All Ireland Pollinators Programme. If If you want to do something that's a good, easy start, and you're already doing it here, of course, in Cork. And there's a special booklet for faith communities to put the pollination plan into action. Here's spiritual, lots of things you can do. Again, you need to find those resources in your own tradition. But this Loving Earth project is a real way of building environmental sense and what we've heard this morning into your worship meetings. Okay, we've a candle goes around from community to community, and people use it as a sort of central feature maybe for a week to think about environmental concerns within the meeting or the church service or whatever they're doing. Okay, I'm not going to go on too much about the practical things because you've already covered a huge amount of that. What you can do about your buildings, your catering, and so forth. This is just a wonderful example that we're sitting in at the moment. It's wonderful. Now, of course, you have the advantage here that's a nice, reasonably modern building, and you can do these things. One of the churches I look after in Youghal is 800 years old this year. It's somewhat more difficult to insulate an 800-year-old building, but there are still many things that can be done. Okay, land. I'm constantly banging on about not being too tidy. What can you leave that doesn't have to be moved? And so many churchyards and graveyards are mown to within an inch of their life, and we need to really get away from this sense of tidiness. Oh, tidiness. Anyway, so these are things. Okay, here's some examples. Churches and fantastic things that are going on in a couple of different churches around the country. Some things. Palm Sunday is a big thing in the Catholic and Church Brown traditions. A couple of places actually bring a donkey along. That's a good way of just getting the nature into the church and the great natural growth. Recycling, tree planting. Okay. Building the connections with your local community is really important. Tiny towns, a clean coast group, work group, they're only looking for communities to work with. We're inclined to work with communities. And finally, there's lots of connections I'm sure you have with the world around groups, faith communities in the developing world. Christian Aid is a great organisation for putting you in touch with those kind of things. Okay, and our award scheme, we have a series of certificates before you get up to the award. And finally, we ask you to mentor another congregation. If you do that, we're a gold award. So there's lots of different denominations that have been doing it. So I ask you, just to finish up, why would you do this? Because it's part of your faith community mission. Because it's really good for bringing in people from all different generations. Okay? Brían is a relatively young, and it's great, and churches, faith communities are looking for young members all the time. This is such an important issue for the generation. Okay? You can do it on an ecumenical basis. It's great publicity locally, get yourself into the papers and on the radio for doing this kind of thing. And it's really, it's a great way of building the profile of your faith community. Finally, it's great fun. Okay? It can be really enjoyable. And I think that's where you build up the hope, because there's nothing like getting people out there and enjoying themselves, working together. And so I think where you're looking for your sources of hope, it's the scriptures, and it's the God that we hope we believe in, and it's also that it's there when you do practical things together that you build that sense of hope and resilience into the world and into your faith community. And when people, as Brían's mentioned it this morning, when people are exhausted from activism and exhausted from campaigning, to come back to your faith community, to build up that resilience once again, and to find in yourself a sense of hope and courage and the chance to pick yourself up and go on again. I think that's what faith communities can do for people who are active in this area, is to give them the sense that you can really build on something that really matters, and that you have a sense of hope to really pick yourself up again, start again, and go on again, and move in the cycle from disappointment to hope. I'll just leave you with one quotation that I really love. It comes from actually a person who's been doing a huge amount of work in this area for years now. That's Bartholomew, who's the ecumenical patriarch, in other words, the leader of the Orthodox churches. and he's based in Constantinople, Istanbul as it's called these days. And he says, the environment, we talk about a crisis in the environment, he said, but there's no crisis in the environment. Crisis is in the human heart. I think that really sums it up. And if we, as faith communities, can build a change of heart into the world, then we're doing the job that we're called to do.
We have one more speaker with us today, Caroline Robinson. Many of us may know her. I certainly have a very fond place in my heart for her every time I eat her vegetables. She and her husband have been growing vegetables chemical-free for about 24 years on their farm in Temple Martin and selling them directly to people through local farmers markets. And I know she's passionate about the connection between humans and the earth and the soil. And so I'm looking forward to hearing what she has to say. Caroline.
Thank you very much. And I have to say that from a distance, I've always admired the Quakers for all the good work you've done with the soup kitchens back in the family and penny dinners now, and then that you're so involved in the environment and so wanting to do good for it. I think that's just fantastic. Now, I always wanted to be a small farmer. I grew up on a small farm. My father was passionate about the environment. He was I'd imagine, one of the first members of the Soil Association, which is the organic association. We used to have those magazines in the house all the time. And I myself then went to live to Africa, and I met Eddie over there. And the one thing that I always noticed was the happiest Africans were those that owned their own farm, no matter what size it was. And I just knew then that that was where we were going to go. So anyway, we came back and we got our farm. And I'll just say two things about it. It's hugely humbling to work with nature. Hugely humbling. But on the other hand, I feel very honoured. And one thing I've noticed the whole way along is that if you don't use chemicals, the soil gets richer and richer every year. And so you end up like us after 24, 25 years of doing it. We have created abundance. The crops come in abundance. And the second thing that is very, very noticeable is how free we are. We are free to think what we want to do, to make our own decisions, and we are free to create machines or whatever we want. If we want to breed a seed, we can breed it towards the way we want it. We are not dependent on anything, really. If the whole country went down tomorrow and there was no money, we probably could live for a year and we'd have stuff to bash with. Now, just think of that, because that's quite important later on. So anyway, all years ago, I think it was 2006, 2007, Al Gore's film came out, An Inconvenient Truth. So I got involved, and we took it around, a troop of us took it around to all the local towns like Bandon and Crewe, and we had a showing in Cork. And I thought, well, now I get to get on and do something about this. And then I went to a meeting Choggish were talking about the future for farmers with climate change. And at that meeting, they said that by 2020, the summers would be too dry and too hot to be able to grow potatoes in Wexford. And then, so I thought, what else could I do? And then I joined the Green Party, and I stood in a couple of elections there. And the first time I went up for election, I made a huge effort. I knocked on over 3,000 doors. And I was all set for great conversations. And the only question anybody asked, really, was, where do I come from? And they meant what part of England. I'm not English at all.
Wow.
So I realised then that to go down the political route was going to take years and years and years, especially in an area like that. And anyway, the elections happened in the spring, which is particularly busy on the farm. So I had to withdraw from the politics. And anyway, so trudled on, plenty of farming and all the rest of it, not thinking too much. And then in 2021, Bill Gates brought out his book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. And I thought to myself, Bill Gates? Interested in the climate? Holy moly, this is one of the guys that we all hate. He's into genetically modifying crops, he's into, oh, I just couldn't bear him. And Vandana Shiva, if you think I go bad about him, she's hopping mad about him. He is now the biggest farmland owner in the US. He is the biggest donor to the Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway, which is really dangerous considering that he makes genetically engineered, so he's control over the seeds. And he is a major shareholder of John Deere tractors, which are now in the midst of a court case in America because farmers, they're being made in such a way that farmers can't fix them. So they are now got the right to repair court case going through. He, his book was written, the reviews on his book were really quite complimentary. And that sort of made me a bit nervous as well, because some of his ideas are very technical. They're things like putting up 12-ton calcium carbonate bomb to block out the sunlight. So anyway, I said to myself, my God, Caroline, you better wake up now, you better start researching what is going on. So anyway, I started a massive year of research, I'd say at least a year, and I started to read all these papers that are all being talked about, and I started to read what things coming from left and right and whatever. And the main thing that I noticed, it hits you bang in the head, is fear. This pushing of fear, crisis, climate catastrophe, code red for humanity. And fear, now I have to say the IPCC, who do the stats, they usually say cause for concern. But fear is like a red flag to me, because years ago I got that book, Conversations with God, by Neil Donald Walsh, and he, just quote what he says, fear is the energy which contracts, closes down, draws in, runs, hides, hoards and harms. Love is the energy which expands, opens up, sends out, stays, reveals, shares and heals. Humans do much better when we're in a loving environment. We really don't cope very well when we're in a fear environment. If I was a captain of a ship and there was it got holed, and if I wasn't the captain of the ship, if the captain was running around like a maniac shouting at us, my God, in 2 days we'll all be dead, you gotta somebody fix the thing. I'd have to get him out of the way, and I'd bring everybody in, and I'd say, now we want calm, rational thinking. I want you all to do your deep breathing, first of all, and now we'll discuss it, and who has good ideas in the room. Now the other thing that I have noticed when you start going into these documents is the numbers, the statistics, the graphs, and I'm going like this, what is this? Is this meant to bother me? So anyway, if I was talking to any of these people who write these documents, I'd be saying to them, could you just tell me, I've lived with nature and worked with nature for bones of 25 years now, and I'm not really noticing climate change. And they'll say to me, well, the computer says this, and if you project this, this is going to happen. And I say, well, how do you know that? What figures are you putting into the beginning? What figures are you putting in at the end? How long are you extrapolating? What happens if the figures you put in at the beginning are slightly off? This is going to be much, much bigger at the end. And then they say to me, well, if you don't take notice, people in the third world are going to suffer. And then I say, okay, I ring up my friend who's farming in Africa, and I say to them, what's the story with you? Like, are you, as a farmer there, can you absolutely say you're experiencing climate change? And they would say to me, we have ups and downs, which we do. We have good years and bad years, same as us. But we have effects of environmental degradation, but I can't say that we've actually got climate change. So then they told me about in the Mount Kenya, really big problems. The waters actually on the Tanzanian side, the waters from Mount Kenya stopped flowing altogether, so the rivers went completely dry. So the bishop in the area got all his congregation together and he said, what are we going to do? So they decided, thousands of them, we are going to plant trees. And what they did for every Sunday for the rest of that year is they took trees up, they sang all the way up, they planted the trees, they had picnics, and then they sang all the way down. And now the rivers flow around Mount Kenya again. You also have the fantastic Niger country. It's the most re-greening African country in Africa. They've done it because they noticed that there were these bushes, scraggy old bushes, and they noticed that if you pruned the bushes and cut all the extra stalks off and just let one grow, it actually grew into a tree. And the beauty of it was, because it was in deserted area, desertification really, the roots were still already there. And so it was only a matter of the tree growing up. And they have re-greened that. The other advantage about this particular tree is it produces leaves that the cattle can eat as well. So they've got a double benefit. And it's also been done by the people, for the people. And it's such a success. And that is moving all the way across West Africa, this idea. Now the other thing that you notice is that you see that the solutions being offered. Now I'm not at all talking about the solutions you've all offered, which are wonderful. I'm talking about the massive solutions. They're all technical and they're all engineering. And some of them are frankly frightening. Some of them, which I think is happening now, but it's very hard to get information officially, anybody to say it's happening. But it's called stratospheric aerosol engineering. And it's basically chemtrails, and it's basically to put substances up there which will form a solar shield so that we'll actually have less sun coming down on top of us, which is frankly ludicrous. We need sun to grow all our plants. And the other thing, so you see, just to go back to my point there about me bringing it up, that maybe climate change hasn't affected me. If I was a scientist, I would possibly be labelled immediately as a climate change denier or a climate skeptic. And the money would no longer come to me as a scientist, and I may lose my job. And I know several scientists who have, because they have spoken out. There's a huge amount of money now going into climate change agenda. Huge. And it's very hard to speak out against it, and it's extremely hard to have a debate about it. The other thing when you look at these news is a lot of connection with the money system. And the money system they would like is for it to go digital, for all the money to be digital. And that, I'm afraid, I'll have to tell you, please be aware of that. That is not good, because it can be controlled. And you can be controlled through your use of the money. And this is what they've trialled in China, social credit system. So there already is a MasterCard credit card out, which is connected with UN, and it's called Economy, and basically it will count the carbon you are using every time you buy, and then it will turn off when you've bought too much. So we just have to be aware of this. I am wondering, why are we being pushed? Is this agenda being pushed on top of us? Why is it being pushed? And I can only come up with the thing that capitalism is collapsing. Capitalism will only go so far. So money will always move up to the top, 1%, and then less and less, because they'll eventually end up owning a lot. We and everybody else down below will end up renting and having to pay them, and it goes up like that. This system is collapsing. And Vandana Shiva wrote a very good book about it, exposing the 1%. There's 2 hedge fund companies in the world who pretty well all their clients own everything. They're Vanguard and BlackRock. So, I think they are pushing us into sustainable development, whatever that means. And if you follow in and see what do they mean by sustainable development, they certainly don't want independent, free-thinking, home food-growing people like me. We are not in the picture at all. They do not want farmers at all. They want machines to grow everything, and they want humans stuck in smart cities. And they want everybody to eat vegan. Now, when I follow that on, you look at the type of food. Bill Gates has a patent out, 14 patents to make the Impossible Burger. And when you look into it, it is going to be something that's made in a vat with microbes and horrible, horrible rubbish you'll be given to eat at the end. Dead, dead, dead. There's no point in eating dead food. You've got to eat real food and be real and alive and part of nature. We are not made to come on the earth to eat rubbish like that. They want only 4 crops: sugarcane, maize, and soya beans, and what's the 4th one? Palm oil. That's the 4 crops they only want, and they want us to be eating that. I could say a bad word there, but I won't. Say it. So we must be really careful. So we must calm ourselves down. We must do some critical thinking. We must steady the ship. We must remember who we are. We are humans. We have the same beginning as humus, the alive, fertile part of the soil. We are humus. We are humans. We are vibrant, clever, electrical beings. We are going to find that out, that we are connected to everything else. Basically, when we've gone with quantum physics and everything, we are electrical beings. And we are interconnected with everything else. Everything else. And we are interconnected particularly with a biodiverse, wonderful, giving, abundant earth. We are not part of a scarcity of everything. Have you ever noticed how everything is scarce? This is, oh, we don't have enough of this. We're coming into a food crisis. Turn off the TV. It's the worst thing. We must turn off the TV because it is engendering fear, fear, fear. And it's wrong, wrong, wrong. So, what are we going to do? We are first going to accept that we have been born at this time in history. This a remarkable time in history. If you follow astrology charts, we are moving from some age into the wonderful age of Aquarius. It's the time of abundance, peace, happiness, community. And we have been put on earth to take us there. It is such an honour, I cannot tell you. And we're going to do it. But the top-down, we're coming out of a top-down society with rules, regulations, pressure, fear. And they're fighting hard now to keep us in the matrix. But we've got to remember where we're going. We're going with it. And it gets even more interesting than that. I follow a man called Rory Duff, and Rory Duff has a wonderful interview with an astrologer called Pam Gregory. Rory Duff is a geobiologist. Yeah, so he was a geologist, and he used to dowse for water. Somebody taught him how to dowse for water when he lived in Africa. And when he came back to England, he got terribly interested in dowsing. So, I don't know if you know, you just use rods. I just made them literally out of coat hangers. He looked into the energy lines. So he started on a major energy line, and he realised that he can pick up the energies. I have tried it, I can pick up the energies. And the most interesting thing is the Earth is giving out a huge amount of energy now from the ground. So not only do we have what the astrologers are talking about coming from above, but we have this huge amount of energy. So energy lines that used to be, we're actually you have the smallest, which used to be about a metre wide. They're all over the place. There's huge grids of them. And then you have the wider ones, and then you have, so the major ones which we go through are, say, through the Hill of Tara, or something where sacred places are. Usually you get sacred places where there's a crossing of energy lines. Those energy lines are much, much wider now. So it's almost going to be the case that in about 2024, the energy lines will be covering the whole Earth. And this is all helping us. So, what we mustn't fall under the trap is we mustn't think that we are just machines that are given food as our fuel. We mustn't denote ourselves as labour units, as just consumers. Or if you see what Yuval Noah Harari, who is, he wrote the book, The Fourth Industrial Revolution. He calls us useless eaters. He thinks that we'll all be replaced by machines and that we'll have nothing to do except play computer games. And that there is actually a patent out by Microsoft, patent 060606, and it's called Verily, and it's to use the brain energy from people playing computers to make cryptocurrency. Yeah. And the man who's behind it all, whose name I don't know, he's in Google Life Sciences, he said it is only through our truth that we are going to defeat Mother Nature. They've even now got a patent out for fake breast milk because they don't need nature. And this is a thing that's happened with dairy cows. Dairy cows have been for so long milked, and their calves have been taken off them at birth, that they're no longer able to be mothers. And dairy farmers now have to be there at the birth, because otherwise the mother will walk on the baby calf. So this is already happening. What I'm talking about is a dystopian world which we must be very careful not to become part of. When we give away our minds and responsibility, we also give away our freedom and our lives. So we must take back our power. And our power isn't here, it isn't our governments, It's here, as people have said before. This is your power. This is your power. This is your connection with the universe. Because the universe, there's no way the universe is going to let that happen. No way. The universe is taking us with her on a most wonderful journey. So the first thing we must do is turn off the TV. Way too much fear. Way too much fear. If I had a magic wand, I'd reduce the paperwork that everybody has to do, particularly farmers, particularly teachers, and particularly nurses. Because they're burdening you with paperwork so you can't think properly. And it must be terrible to be a sick person who's in a hospital, terribly lonely, and all she sees is nurses scurrying around filling out computer appointments. They touch. We must remember the basics. Touch is such a healing power. And it's so important. Love is by a mile the most powerful thing ever.
I am very honored.
And the other thing that we've got to remember is that when they're making you do all this paperwork, they are actually mining your information. And then they can make a machine do it instead of you. And this is what they've done with farmers. So they take all the information out of you and then they put it into a machine. And then you can do computer games. Now, the other thing that's interesting is in farming we have a problem, because if you're a farmer or if you are a rich businessman, you can buy land and you can rent it to a dairy farm tax-free. So this is really distorting the land for people to buy land. So basically businessmen are buying up land in Ireland and they're renting it to dairy farmers tax-free. We'll have to get rid of that because it doesn't give a chance for anybody to get in and buy land. We need to get rid of carbon credits, because carbon credits are where I could be a pollution company and I can just, you see it with the dairy farmers. A big dairy farm will buy a piece of forestry and that will equate to its pollution farm over here. And it's a big land grab by rich people because it doesn't leave any land for the small, poor little people. And they're not at all interested actually in looking after that piece of land. They're just interested in buying a forestry to counteract, to make balance their books. We need to get rid of another problem. We have area aid. Farmers around the country, poorer farmers, they get an aid supplement, it's called area aid, and X amount per acreage. But if the satellite picture notices that they have a hedgerow, and the hedgerow is bigger than it was on the original map, they will get penalised. So what's happened now is that all these farmers are cutting out their hedgerows because they don't want to be penalised. We should be paying them to put back their hedgerows. Duncan Stewart of EcoQuakers has one of the best solutions. He says that every farmer should be paid to have trees on either side, 10 metres on either side of a river or water. I could go on and on and on of all things, but it doesn't matter. I'll just leave you with some words of Vandana Shiva. Now go more spiritual, go more interconnected, go more celebratory in the abundance we can create. Thank you.